Thanks, everyone. This is a meeting of the Report and Advisory Board Review Commission. Just want to start off by taking a roll call of the people who are here. Jeff Tumkinnick-Sem from Operations.
Kwame Akosa from the Law Department.
Stacy Gardner, DeWitt.
Rose Martinez, City Council.
Brad Reed, City Council.
Zach Pyle, Mayor's Office of Management and Budget.
Pauline Toole, Department of Records and Information Services.
Aaron Cooler, Operations.
James Archer, Operations.
Fiona Peach, Operations.
Great, thanks all for coming here to this meeting. We want to go over a couple of the works to date and then also discuss a couple of next steps in terms of review of actual reports that were submitted by agencies. On the first, just to kind of review from our mission, reports should serve as informative and transparent tools that help New Yorkers to evaluate the efficacy and efficiency of their local government. An advisory board should advance collaboration and provide relevant insights to city agencies, partners, and constituents. As a recap for the public and to those who are here in this meeting, the work to date, the Commission has been meeting regularly since May of 2018. Public hearing was held on December 2018, presenting kind of the approach that the committee was taking. There was feedback received that validated the approach, and there was a desire reinforced to reduce the number of required reports. The Office of Operations conducted an outreach to all city agencies to follow up with that regarding the reporting requirements. The office, with guidance from the committee, developed and sent out a rubric to guide agencies on how they should review their thoughts and providing responses. And the office compiled and conducted an initial analysis of agency responses. So essentially just a first batch for candidates of reports for the waiver. And so wanted to give an opportunity first for people to kind of chime in and say anything they may need. One, on the operations side specifically, we wanted to certainly explain, obviously there wasn't a lot of time to kind of go into depth about the reports, but also wanted to reiterate that this isn't a meeting to make any votes or decisions, so much as to have a conversation about some of the documents that were provided, give us an opportunity to kind of discuss whether or not there's any extra guidance necessary or other questions that we may want to direct towards the nominating agencies, but understand that, you know, going forward, especially after this first batch, we want to provide more time to review, but at the same time do want to learn from this experience. So I think that as we go through different kind of reports that are nominated by the agencies, we'll learn a little bit more about the type of questions we may want to ask up front. With that being said, I'll first kind of throw it out. Are there any kind of questions or comments that people want to raise about kind of that approach and what's gone on before?
So I wanted to recommend that when we do submit recommendations to the City Council of reports that we waive, that we do it as, even if we deal with them in tranches or deal with them in small groups, that we do it as a collective one message to the Council of what we think our big piece of reports and advisory boards are. I think from certainly the Council's perspective, it's a lot easier to handle rather than piecemeal every 2 months, which would be just difficult to fit into the workflow of the Council.
And as a reminder both to the public and maybe to the committee members, from a process standpoint, the committee has the authority to kind of consider and waive reports so that agencies don't have to kind of continue reporting them, but there is a secondary function to which the council would have a role, because while we may waive them from their responsibility to kind of perform and report out on those, there is still kind of information in the ad code about kind of the requirement for that. And so this effort that Brad's talking about is trying to align the two, and I think that's a great thing for us to learn from in the next couple of tranches as we go through. We'll get a better sense of how many as well, and so we can set timeframes either concretely saying every X number, or if the timing is such that we get through a lot more faster, then maybe that's a different type of thing. But in this first, I think today we'll go through 9 nominated reports from agencies, and we'll see how that goes. And at least currently, the thinking is that we'll take the opportunity to ask some questions, go through them here. We'll take the next month or so to kind of just further consider, figure out what other questions we may want. And then the plan, at least right now, is that in late April, early May, we would have another meeting where we would formally vote on whether or not these would apply, these reports apply for the waiver. Does that make sense?
I have
Yes.
a question, but did you mean a separate for reports and a separate for boards and commissions, or you wanted it all at one mix?
It wasn't necessarily separate for reports and, or advisory boards or for mixed. It was more of, if we're going to be reporting out to the council within this, year, next couple months, the more we can put them together into single groups, the better. So like, rather than, vote on some number of these 9 and then vote on the next some number of these 9, better we combined and sent several groups together. If we are voting, my preference would be that we vote, say, to forward it to the final recommendation, and then have a vote once we've compiled several into the final recommendation to submit that.
That's great. Yeah, we'll take a look at that.
Is this not V9? Are there other groups of reports?
Yeah, so agencies have sent several, and we've tried to do, based on the rubric review, kind of highlight those that kind of most qualify, and then putting that forth to the committee. As we get more and review more will come, and we'll try to do that in kind of, our original thinking was a group for to present to the committee for consideration. A month passes by, voting on those, another set that's provided, and we'll try to do it as early as possible so that people get as much time as necessary to review, but at a minimum, we would try to do that. And then, to Brad's suggestion, we'll have a separate discussion about when we actually want to kind of pile whatever group, and I think Brad will need a little more guidance from you as we go through these to say what's a good tranche to further on for actual decision.
And I just add, the charter requires, so there's a 120-day clock for the council to act, and that clock starts when this commission transmits its determinations or files its determinations with the council. So we could make the determinations, but then put off the filing to a date that would be more acceptable for the council.
Great. That helps a lot. So with that, we'll move towards the reports themselves. I'll start with just a premise on some of the guiding themes. I think many of the agencies were provided this, but per the charter, the commission must review the reporting and advisory group boards at a future date. Requirements for utility, relevance, and value. The overarching goals are efficiency, efficacy, and transparency. Focused on utility, a report should aid city operations, oversight, decision-making, and or resource allocation. Relevance, a report should be about topics that are relevant to the city at this time and take into account that the agency, office, and citywide goals evolve over time. And value, a report should be worth the cost of production and gathering and staff time it takes to develop the product, and should not be duplicative of other efforts that are already occurring. So with that, Zach, to your specific comment, we received 39 requests for waiver from initial agency outreach. Relevance and value were the top reasons for the waiver requests. We received requests to amend frequency or to merge several that were occurring at different times, but basically are the same thing. The commission will be examining the reports using a phased approach to allow for a thorough review. So at this point, we've got 9. That way, hopefully, it allows the commission members kind of a reasonable amount of time to look at just a small component of these and give some thoughtful review to them. So with that being said, these should be considered kind of low-hanging fruit. They meet a lot of the initial criteria. They'll probably get a little more difficult as we go on, but we tried to kind of pick those that kind of hit on all the utility, relevance, and value all at the same time. Law Department and Operations have reviewed all the submitted waiver requests and basically found that, at least for these that we were submitting, they meet the administrative code and the applicable legislation in terms of determining the viability for a waiver. And we've also reached out to agencies to clarify language and requests and ask questions. That doesn't mean that we all here can't present additional questions that we would ask. And before we go into these, just as a statement, if you have no questions, silence is not consent. Again, we are not voting, and so there's no need to worry about if there are reasons to ask questions, great. If you want to discuss, great. But there's no action here that forces a decision. So we're not making that determination here. So in terms of agency breakdowns, as you'll see here, there were 9 reports. one from each of DCAS, DHS, DOC, NYC and Company, NYPD, and 2 from DOT and DYCD. That will go on to the first report. DCAS put forth their assessment of city facilities regarding certain clean on-site power generation technologies. They basically found that it was a duplicative report, that the technology of the cogen kind of technologies was not as much of a focus for the city, maybe not as viable, and that the intense resources necessary to kind of validate were for a low value, since it is not a focus of the city going forward at this point. So, any questions or discussion on that? Again, mostly for kind of any questions we have about what we would use to kind of review, or of any questions you would want from the agencies that would help you in your review. Yes?
So this is a procedural question rather
Sure.
than about this specific report, but before we did the outreach to the agencies, all of the members of the commission went through a list of all the reports or a subset of the reports, and, filled out that rubric, making sort of the best judgments that we could. I was wondering what effect, what was done with those rubrics? I mean, was what was shared with the agencies at all the result of what the commission members put in their rubrics, or was it a completely separate
Sure,
process?
I can answer that. We took the rubrics and we just made sure that where we presented these initial 9, somebody from the commission had also flagged those. So that's out of this batch of 39 waivers that we received. A lot of these ones were where they overlap. Like the commission had said, we either need more information about this, or we think this is a good candidate for waiver, and the agency agreed on it, which is what makes this the first batch.
Okay.
And then we still have all of the commission members' notes, because there was a lot of feedback. We need more information about this report, so we still have all of that on background, but it's just a little too much to bring into a commission meeting right now, but we have it there for future reference.
Okay, so understanding that this first batch is low-hanging fruit, at a subsequent meeting, will those other batches involve potentially reports that were not identified by members of the commission, but that the agencies who really know the material better
Yes.
flag this?
Yeah, I mean, part of I think, Zach, you were one of the main people kind of pushing for trying to get a review first by the agencies, and so that we've done. And low-hanging fruit, as you can see, like, there's a lot of overlap, and then others that have open questions. There'll be some that the committee nominated that were not reflected in the agencies, and vice versa, and we'll try to grapple with those as we move forward.
And I just want to clarify one thing that I said. We gave agencies all of their reports, not just things that were flagged by the commission. So that's gonna clear up.
So hearing no more specific questions to that, we'll move on to the second report, which is a DHS report. It's an outreach report. As you see, was conceived to quarterly gauge outreach efforts, and the agency feels that that is an outdated report, given the fact that there have been enhancements in other reports and automated systems, actually, to gather information about the same thing through the Homestat and Turning the Tide reports. Furthermore, more recent law than that, which is certainly first established in 1999, as recent as 2017, kind of established other requirements that duplicate/supersede some of those requirements.
Were these comments given by DHS for this report?
They were given, and then we cross-referenced in terms of kind of whether or not they did in fact, meet the kind of guidance of the rubrics of utility and efficacy.
Did the commission here also were in agreement with what the agencies said?
I don't know specifically though. Yeah.
I don't think we had anything as specific as agreeing with the agency, but at some point the commission had identified this report as possibly meeting the requirements for a waiver. So then what we used the agency responses for was, well, they gave us the detail. So this is our opportunity to see if we as a commission agree with what they're saying. I think that's one of the primary reasons for this meeting. And if we have questions, we're not quite sure if we're agreeing with what they're saying, we're happy to do the work and reach out to the agency to some deeper diving into this.
So for this one, if the council disagrees, Should we?
Yeah.
Okay, so, our general welfare committee staff, in which DHS falls under their purview, finds the report extremely useful. They're also a little, frustrated that this report is not received timely, which is one of their concerns. They also don't believe that turning the tide is something that, like, gives all the details in which this report would. And they're not too sure in terms of like the OTDA plan. That's something I think the state mandate, but it's not something that the council receives. In terms of local law 217 from 2017, it doesn't provide information on placements, in which the outreach report does. They also stated that the hope count is yearly and not quarterly, in which this outreach report is supposed to be received to us, and that the coverage is small. The last report we received for this outreach report was in 2016. They stated that this report allows for the council to evaluate the DHS's effectiveness in outreaching and placing the homeless.
So we take that back to the agency.
Yeah.
You provide super helpful. Great. Thank you. The next report for consideration, DOC. This is a requirement for a punitive segregation and enhanced supervision housing report related to the use of these housing units and the mental health units in the city for the previous quarter. This actually was a point-in-time report that doesn't reflect changes to the department's policy since then about placement, criteria for placement, and also different other housing models that exist for the same population. It's duplicative of other reports required by oversight bodies like the Board of Correction, and not aligned time-wise, so the argument on that from a resource standpoint is they're off time, same effort, but two different bodies, and you could get it publicly from one of the bodies like the Board of Correction. And so with that, they argue kind of the burden, resource burden of it in producing something that is not quite up to date, but similar to something that is required of the board, requiring more up to date information.
So, when we ran it past committee staff, the response was that they look at it, they look at the report regularly, and that they found it helpful. I'm a messenger here, so
Yeah.
I understand that there are other people at the table who may have more expertise on corrections issues. It could be anyone. But the committee staff did say that if there is different or better data on the same subject that is available, they're not familiar with it, or that could be used as a substitute.
Sure.
One of the things they said was that perhaps the concern is that the reporting is somewhat outdated in some way, and if that's the case, then rather than completely waive it, perhaps there should be a conversation about how it can be updated, but still retained in some manner.
Yeah, and I don't think I'm here to opine on the agency so much, but just as a couple of options to at least consider on that is just whether or not there's an acceptance of another report that goes to a different body and taking that, or at least changing the actual definition of the thing required just to reflect changes in policy that have occurred now. So as options, there are a couple of different ways to look at it.
Can we perhaps, or operations, I guess I'm suggesting, could you potentially facilitate the council's access to the report that's made to the Board of Corrections so that they the council could look at whether or not it would be a reasonable substitute?
Yeah, I think that we can certainly get
Just
copies and frequency. Yep. Okay. On number 4, there is a Department of Transportation report on high pedestrian crash location reports. On this one, the position was that this report is a subset of a fuller report located within the Vision Zero kind of updates that the Vision Zero kind of process, not just in its reports, but in its online and automated kind of upfront information, already includes much of this information in a more automated fashion. And from a resource standpoint, better to focus on just updating and having relevant public interest kind of pull from the Vision Zero website and databases. Any questions on that? Okay, great. Another Department of Transportation, and this we found a little fascinating. It's a stray voltage report. There are arguments over, one, the usefulness of the report, because based on the DOT kind of reporting, there has not been an instance of stray voltage since at least 2009. So there is a kind of a resource and a value kind of argument that if with increases in advancements in technology and protections and so forth, whether or not it is still a necessary report when nothing has happened since 2009. And again, I think this one we are certainly trying to get a little more information from the department just to kind of understand exactly where, but that's the initial position. That if something has not occurred and they were trying to look for it for 10 years, we're still producing a report.
Is there was there a backstory to this?
I don't know it, to be honest, and that's why I actually specifically said
Yeah.
we will ask some
Yeah,
questions.
no, I
I had some
understand. Yeah, sorry, I
questions.
apologize. I did hear you say that. I don't know if I find it comforting that it hasn't happened for 10 years or that the need for the report was at some point there.
Yeah.
So yeah, the other thing is, aside from backstory, just 200. How could 200 hours per year for this report? I'm just curious how that.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Here, so then the flip side of that is, does that imply, if this report is waived, are inspections going to cease for this?
So
thing?
that actually was the question that I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, understood. Nothing in 10 years. That's great, and maybe the problem was solved.
Yeah.
And that's great too. It raised a lot of questions.
Yes.
So
in
that
that
actually,
regard.
Brad, not to interrupt you, but we've reached out to DOT because that raised some flags for us as well, and we'll hopefully get you guys, all of you guys, some more information on what we're looking at in this report. I think a way to paraphrase your question is, if we get rid of this, what are we losing?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm just curious how they were tracking what stray voltage was. Like, what was the
Sure.
mechanism? Because as a dog walker, I know that dogs have been susceptible to stray voltage incidents, and maybe that doesn't rise to the level that requires a report by DOT. But so what exactly is the subset? I
Yeah.
think would be of value to know.
Yeah, there was one thing in the language that DOT submitted that hinted at they inspect structures, Con Ed structures. So I'm not sure if that means their inspections are limited just to things that are on streets. I don't know what kind of structures they're looking at, but yeah, it might not be just normal city streets.
Right.
So we're reaching out for answers to that.
And maybe
Yeah.
it's power transformers, in
Yeah.
which case, we're glad there's
I mean,
no
and-
incidents.
And this definitely met some criteria at the top level, but I think we also saw that we need to get some more information, so we'll get that to the committee.
So through this process, we
Yeah.
wouldn't be able to waive the annual inspection procedures that they're conducting here, just the report that they
Yes,
file
that's
with
right.
the council.
Tech,
So they're still going to be conducting the inspection presumably, so.
Well, unless they were not otherwise required to do the inspection, the only reason they were doing the inspection was so they'd have information to report.
Fair point, I don't see how we could, through this process, waive requirements for safety inspection, but if that is integral to the reporting, then perhaps.
And that actually relates to a question I have, which is, if there are 0 incidents, and presumably if there were an incident, there'd be an incident report, and then when they do their annual report, they would rely on those incident reports, then what are they doing for 200 hours? I mean, I haven't seen the report. It just seems to me the report would say there have been no incidents.
yeah, and then we don't know the methodology, and so in terms of inspection, certainly if, for sidewalk inspections, you certainly have lots of hours where people are driving around to just see if there's sanitation pickups, even if everything is okay. So depending on whatever the methodology is, you could see, but it is a question. What are you doing for 200 hours? And basically, is that an effective way to collect this information? Do we need to collect the information? It may be the only way to do it, in which case, if you have no incidents, then you'd want to waive it. If not, so we'll take a look.
Okay, and I mean, to your point, to the extent that such sidewalk inspections are independently required, then I don't think it's fair to allocate that time to the report.
Right.
It should be allocated to
Sure.
a separate legal requirement, and then, you know, the hours for creating a report would be a separate matter.
Okay. Yeah, we'll take a look at it. Great. We'll follow up on that one. On number 6, this is from the NYC and Company about a report tracking the New York City Sports Commission. It's a New York City Sports Commission report about a New York Sports Commission that no longer exists. So the report was created to report on its operations, but it has not existed for some time, having been somewhat integrated and folded into the NYC and Company. So the basic argument was just that there's no need to report on it since it doesn't exist anymore.
So
Yep.
I had a couple questions, and I also just became hyper aware that I don't no idea what the back of my head looks like right now, but everyone watching this does.
It looks great.
Yeah.
It looks great.
It's like cool now.
Yeah.
So I looked for the executive order and I couldn't find it. That was the first thing. I checked 2008, and then I even checked some like the deputy mayor ones where sometimes they'll rearrange things. And actually in one of the deputy mayor ones, I find the sports commission reference, so it still existed as of that EO, because it was put under the deputy mayor for economic development. But I couldn't find an EO reassigning it, we'll say. So I may have just missed that, but if there is one, I'd appreciate being able to see
Sure.
it. The other thing is, I did find a press release on it, so it certainly happened. I just don't know the mechanism.
Yeah.
I cannot disagree that if it's not meeting, then a report on its meetings is somewhat pointless. That being said, just in looking at this, there's my counsel lawyer side, which somewhat took issue if there was no EO and this was merged into a non-totally city entity, and then it's a charter mandated body with a mandated report, and then that being used as the reason why we get rid of the report. It doesn't seem like you can transfer a responsibility outside of a city agency and then say, well, this non-city entity doesn't, you can't require them to report, so therefore there shouldn't be a report. Is that making sense?
Mm-hmm.
I don't disagree that the report is perhaps not relevant anymore, and it was not this administration that transferred this, so it's not a criticism of anyone here. I'm just trying to better understand exactly what happened,
Sure.
and flagging that just from the council's perspective, if we pass a law, if we create an entity, and then it gets transferred to a non-city agency, and then that somehow gets rid of all the requirements we created by law, I will say, that there may be people who have an issue, but perhaps since we're just talking about the report, that would be okay, but I wanted to flag it.
Sure. Yeah. And I think we can treat those as two separate things. One, just on the utility of the report itself.
Yes.
You're reporting on something that doesn't exist versus whatever the
Yeah.
legal implication of requiring something of a body is.
And I think we've actually looked at this ourselves, so understood and agreeing that the utility of the report is about zilch at the
Okay.
moment. But just I'm flagging that because
Sure.
in looking for the EO, it brought up the other questions.
Yep. Got it. All right, we'll take a look at that. For number 7, this is the NYPD's nomination of their 911 operational time analysis report. And their position is it was created to track response times for 911 calls, but much of the information required in this report is now published online in a searchable format, as required by local law in 2013. So finding that the report is duplicative of much of all the information actually that is available online.
Well, I think that, I mean, the Y line says much, and then the subsequent line sort of states flatly that it's duplicative. So, I mean, one question I have is it really all or is it much? And what are we losing?
Yep.
And it's sort of a larger procedural question. There have been a few projects that very helpfully council has commented on and given us some additional context. But where we don't have that comment from council's representatives, all we have perhaps is the comment from the agency, which is pulled in a bunch of different directions. They're concerned with headcount to an extent. Obviously, they're concerned with serving the public, but without a counter view, I'm just concerned that in some cases, perhaps this one, we might be losing something without realizing it. If all we're relying on is the agency to tell us, yes, you can get everything else in this other report, because we've heard conflicting opinions on a few reports from council, and so I don't have an answer. It's just a concern that I have.
No, I think that's inherently something that everyone's gonna value the utility and the, efficacy and then the resource kind of burden on their own, and I think that's why the committee is here to kind of suss out a little bit and make some determination. So, yeah, good to ask. I think Brad has been good about asking council staff on a couple of these where it's particularly relevant, and we'll raise those to the agencies.
And I do have a question on this one too. Because local law 119, which actually in a prior position I worked on, it was about fire and medical emergencies. But when I pulled up, because they mentioned two sections here, 14-149 and 14-150. 14-149 was on police emergencies. So it seems to be covering a different universe of emergency response times.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible that police emergencies are also reported on, and there's something else duplicative. I'm just not sure that local law 119 is what's duplicative. And when I looked at 14-150, which I hadn't honestly looked at prior to this, it seems to cover things like academy training materials and personnel assignments, or personnel allocation rather, which 119 definitely doesn't cover. So it may be that it's duplicative because there may be other reporting requirements on 911. I'm just not sure that 119 is fully it.
Okay, we'll ask on that. Okay. Anything else on this one? Okay. Number 8, DYCD on their annual youth services report. This one requires reporting on youth services, financial indicators, personnel indicators, performance goals. The rationale of considering this is that all of the information included in this report and additional details are already included in the annual DYCD MMR reporting. It's duplicative, but because of the timing and it's two basically efforts on two different things. So just combining it within the required report of the MMR seems to meet all of the requirements. Question here?
So just
Okay.
I would say what Zach said. For this one, if the agency could give us a little more on the one-to-one. Because I did look at the MMR and I did look at the requirement, but this is not my expertise area. So if they could provide a little more information, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. And the final report for today's consideration, also from DYCD. This is the Community Services Block Grant. And this goes back to kind of the other comment about correction, where there's the rationale is that the information provided in a separate report to the state is duplicative of a lot of the efforts of this, and so is it possible to essentially produce one of those things and transfer it over to council or to others, or particularly given that it is a particular fund requirement for the other report, so they have to produce it to get the funds, and so can that just be handed over?
Is the report to the state public right now?
Not that we could find.
Okay. So I have two questions, because when I looked up the law, the law literally said just hand over the same report that you're sending to the state.
Okay.
So I mean, if the state one's public,
Yeah.
then there's no need for that requirement. We
Yeah.
can just go look it up on
Yeah.
DOS website or something. If it's not public, then
We can go back to them and ask
Yeah.
what the deal with making it public is.
and the section they cited is broader than just that report. It also includes two other reports. a report to the governor and state legislature, and also a comprehensive planning report. So just, I don't know if they intended to include those, or if they did not intend to include those, but just so I know the scope.
Okay. Yeah, it was pretty clear that they can in fact just submit the same thing. Seems here at least that it's a separately prepared report. Maybe that's just a public information issue, but.
Which we wouldn't want them to separately
Yeah.
prepare the same thing, 100%.
Okay. That's that for the individual reports that are kind of considered for today. We'll take back a lot of the questions and requests for further information and try to get that to everybody, certainly before the other meeting. And a lot of the answers and kind of feedback from the committee will then determine kind of when we actually have the next committee hearing. In terms of next steps, as I started to say, we'll continue to field those questions. We'll continue to also take a look at the other submissions from the agencies to start kind of framing out which are for further consideration for the committee. Right now, at least we're planning on the late April. Again, we'll determine the time based on that. And then we'll continue to work with the mayor's office appointments on the advisory boards, and we'll get a list circulated to the commission members in the coming months. Any questions on kind of this process that we went through? And so beyond the individual questions that we're going to ask for the agencies, from a process standpoint, going through these in piecemeal, is that helpful to everyone? Again, more detail once you review it,
But we should talk about how our determinations will be transmitted to the council and in accordance with the charter, making sure the clock starts at a certain time, and so the council has plenty of time to consider.
Okay, we'll take that in.
And I just want to say, I appreciate you said earlier that going forward, we'll try to, this is like a learning step, and that, once this becomes part of the process, just routine, where he said there'd be like a little more time to review, and then now we sort of know coming in what we should be looking for. So I just want to say thank you.
No, and thanks for all your patience as well. I think all of us are trying to figure out the best way to kind of get piecemeal information without just over flooding and getting too much out there too. Okay. Any remaining comments before I, move to adjourn? All right. No, I think we can officially close and adjourn this meeting. Thank you all for attending. Appreciate it.
Thank you.